The National Post is reporting one of Canada's most admired human rights experts, Irwin Cotler, has found himself at the center of a controversy at the University of Toronto. He's being accused of anti-Palestinian racism by some of the faculty at the school, which is itself often criticized for having antisemitism as a major problem on its campus. Irwin Cotler gave a speech on January 26 that was meant to reflect on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The event was meant to discuss the contemporary antisemitism. Cotler's speech discussed anti-Semitic racism from a systemic level from a human rights perspective, with a focus on addressing antisemitism through equality. His speech prompted complaints from 45 University of Toronto faculty members who've claimed that he reinforced anti-Palestinian racism. These faculty members have accused Cotler of suggesting that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. This is a huge issue that has been going on for a very long time, where it is definitely socially acceptable to criticize a state of any kind, including the state of Israel. Of course, this in itself is not necessarily anti-Semitic, so unfortunately there are a lot of people who equate anti-Semitism and anti-Israel as one. I definitely don't think it's that easy and clear cut, and I've actually come up with a pretty simple plan on how to figure out whether or not someone's criticism of Israel is legitimate, or if someone's criticism of Israel might be based on some unfortunate views of anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, whatever you want to call it. Oftentimes we hear many people speak out against Israel, claiming there's issues with human rights, there's issues with Palestinians, all of these legitimate criticisms of a state, which of course battles with its own internal struggles, as do many states in the world. These in itself are not anti-Semitic. If someone was to criticize Israel for their policy on the Judea and Samaria issue or foreign policy, these are legitimate criticisms and issues that you can bring up. The one major flaw in that is if this person, unfortunately, seems to ignore all other issues in all other states around the world. If someone is speaking out about human rights for the Palestinians who are living within Judea and Samaria or Gaza, these are legitimate criticisms and legitimate questions to ask. The question is that same person, of course, asking about Syrian rights or Jordanian Palestinian rights or any of these other groups that are being persecuted, China and the way that Muslims in China are being killed and put into concentration camps. If these people have not spoken out against those issues, rightfully so, then you have to question why they're not speaking out against those issues. Oftentimes when you ask someone why they're not bringing this up, they'll say, well, there's too many issues. I can only kind of focus on one at a time. And I've decided for whatever reason to start with Israel of all things. Maybe that's true. Maybe they should actually consider bringing up human rights all over the world. Unfortunately, criticism of Israel and only Israel as the only place in the world that has no freedom for Muslims or Christians or any people other than Jews would be an unfortunate situation. It's just not true. In fact, within Israel itself, not including some of the Judea and Samaria areas or Gaza, which is not part of the state of Israel, Israeli Arabs or Arabs who have chosen to take citizenship within the state of Israel have full equal rights to everyone else in the state. They serve on high courts, they serve within the government, and they can speak freely. They have the freedom of the press, and they actually have been many times asked, if there's an eventual Palestinian state, would you move to it? And the majority usually say no. They feel much safer and much better in a democratic state like Israel. That is not to say, of course, that there are no challenges within Israel when it comes to all of the groups getting along. But of course, there is something to be said when you pick out that one area of the world and flat out ignore everything else that's happening in the world, because apparently it is too difficult to talk about two things at once. Or, frankly, have one unified view on human rights that extends past everybody in the world and not only the people that you feel deserve human rights and others who don't. I'm not suggesting, of course, that anybody who is pro-Palestinian is somehow anti-Semitic. In fact, I myself would consider myself to be pro-Palestinian in the sense that I believe the Palestinian people deserve self-determination and rights and freedoms from the governments that are over top of them and keeping them in the lifestyles that they're used to. Of course, Israel has its challenges to make peace with these groups, but unfortunately, Israel is not the only one to blame here. When it comes to Irwin Cotler and his suggestion that anti-Israel is being anti-Semitic or suggesting any type of idea like that, I can't say what he intended. But of course, they do rely one close on the other. So someone who is anti-Israel could just be anti-Israel for legitimate reasons. However, sometimes you find that they're ignoring the democratic nature of the country, the free press, the freedom to be gay and LGBTQ within the country. And then there's people who ignore all of those things and speak out against Israel while staying silent on the Muslims and the other people who are being murdered across the same region. That, I would suggest, would be anti-Semitic, or at least have some sort of anti-Semitic double standard. Like I said earlier in the podcast, unfortunately, university campuses have become a hotbed for this anti-Israel hate, the anti-Israel rallies, many of which are based on anti-Semitic views, and many of them contain people who would rather see the Israelis killed by missiles and bombs by terrorists rather than seeing actual peace. Irwin Cotler bringing out this fact that many people who are anti-Israel can be anti-Semitic is not in itself something that should be criticized. It should be something that the side who is anti-Israel for legitimate reasons distance themselves from those people. However, instead, they like to double and triple down and make sure that these allies they have within the anti-Semitic views will stay on their side. Because you know what? In the end, an ally is an ally, and I don't really care why you feel the way I feel, but I'm glad you do, so you can stand next to me at a protest. And that is really honestly shameful. If someone was to believe in human rights and gay rights and women's rights and all of these things, they, in theory, should do that across the board, no matter what country it is, no matter what majority of a religion it has. They should stand for those rights, no questions asked, and it shouldn't change. In the end, I think that anti-Semitism, unfortunately at this point, is not really going anywhere. I think that organizations and big groups should be a little bit more careful when they put out statements to make sure that they are considering the anti-Semitic issues that they're facing and trying to solve. I also think that people like the ADL are trying to do a great job in removing it from the internet, a feat that will probably be almost impossible, but at least they're trying to fix that. And lastly, I think that people should call out anti-Semitism where it is and not hide behind the idea of this person agrees with my views on Israel, so I'm okay with them being anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. I think we should all call out anti-Semitism wherever we see it, even if those people agree with us. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Thank you for listening. Take a look at some of our other episodes, and don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast. We'll see you next time.